Ever notice how some backyards seem to attract every mosquito in the neighborhood, while others feel completely fine just a few houses away? A lot of people assume it's random, or that bugs simply show up during summer no matter what. But after spending more time working around my own yard, I started noticing something interesting. Tiny habits most of us never think about can quietly turn a backyard into the perfect place for mosquitoes and other pests to hang around. And honestly, I didn't realize I was doing some of those things myself until I made a few simple changes. What surprised me most was that the biggest difference didn't come from expensive sprays, bug zappers, or chemical treatments. It came from fixing a few small mistakes that were basically inviting bugs in every evening. One of the biggest things that attracts mosquitoes is standing water, and the annoying part is how easy it is to miss. Most people picture huge puddles or dirty ponds, but mosquitoes can breed in surprisingly small amounts of water. Sometimes it's just the little tray under a flower pot that hasn't been emptied in days. Other times it's a bucket left outside after rain, clogged gutters, kids' toys sitting in a corner, or even a bird bath that rarely gets fresh water. I started noticing that the worst mosquito spots in my yard were always the dampest little areas nobody paid attention to. And once the weather gets warm, it doesn't take long before bugs start multiplying fast. What helped more than anything was simply checking those spots regularly. Dumping out water every few days made a noticeable difference. I also started changing the water in the bird bath more often and turning containers upside down whenever they weren't being used. Even improving drainage around a few plant beds helped the yard feel less humid overall. It wasn't some huge backyard makeover either. Just small habits that slowly made the space less inviting for mosquitoes. But water isn't the only thing that makes bugs feel at home. Another thing that quietly attracts bugs is when plants are packed too closely together. A lot of people love that thick, lush garden look, especially during summer when everything grows fast and fills in beautifully. Honestly, I used to think a fuller garden automatically meant a healthier one. But after a while, I noticed the buggiest parts of the yard were usually the areas where plants were crowded together the most. Those spots stay darker, more humid, and there's barely any airflow moving through. And for mosquitoes, aphids, and even fungus problems, that's basically the perfect environment. Have you ever walked into a corner of your yard that suddenly felt cooler and strangely full of bugs? That heavy, damp feeling usually means air is getting trapped. Once I started spacing out a few pots, trimming overgrown branches, and letting more sunlight pass through the plants, the whole area felt different almost immediately. Not dry or empty, just fresher. Even sitting outside in the evening became more comfortable. Sometimes the goal isn't adding more plants. It's giving the ones you already have enough space to breathe. And once moisture gets trapped in those crowded areas, another problem usually starts. Another mistake that attracts bugs without people realizing it is keeping the soil constantly wet. A lot of us get into the habit of watering on a fixed schedule, every morning or every evening, just automatically turning on the hose because it feels like the responsible thing to do. The problem is, plants don't always need water that often, especially if the soil is already holding moisture underneath. And when the ground never really gets a chance to dry out, it becomes the perfect place for fungus, gnats, mosquitoes, and even mold to start showing up. I noticed this most with potted plants. The surface looked dry, so I kept watering them, but underneath the soil stayed damp for days. That's usually when those tiny flying bugs suddenly appear around the plants and somehow end up inside the house too. What helped was simply checking the soil first, instead of watering out of habit. I also stopped watering late in the evening because everything stayed wet overnight. Morning watering worked much better. Using a lighter layer of mulch and improving drainage around a few containers made a surprisingly big difference too. The yard still looked healthy, but it stopped feeling constantly damp. But even a healthy garden can start attracting pests if old plant material begins piling up. Another thing that can quietly turn a yard into a bug hotspot is dead leaves and leftover yard debris. It doesn't seem like a big deal at first. A few wet leaves under a bush or some old plant material sitting in the corner feels pretty normal, especially after rain. I used to think leaving everything on the ground made the yard feel more natural and low maintenance. But after a while, I started noticing more bugs hiding in those damp areas than anywhere else. Earwigs, ants, slugs, little worms, all kinds of things seem to love dark piles of wet organic material especially during hot and humid weather. The tricky part is that these spots often stay moist much longer than the rest of the yard. Even when everything else dries out, those piles underneath can still feel wet for days. Once I started cleaning up leaves more regularly, the yard immediately felt less heavy and cluttered. I also stopped piling thick layers of mulch too close to the house and became more careful with compost so it stayed contained instead of spreading moisture everywhere. Small cleanup habits made a bigger difference than I expected. And strangely enough, some pest problems don't come from the ground at all. One thing I never paid attention to before was how much outdoor lighting can affect bug activity at night. A lot of backyards look great with bright lights turned on in the evening, especially those cool white LED lights people install around patios, fences, or garden paths. The problem is, flying insects are heavily attracted to that kind of lighting. Moths, mosquitoes, and all sorts of tiny bugs seem to gather around it within minutes. And once they show up, spiders and other pests usually follow too. I started noticing this every summer. The brightest corner of the yard was always the area with the most bugs flying around. Even when the rest of the backyard felt fine, that one spot looked like a magnet for insects. Switching to warmer lights actually helped more than I expected. I also stopped leaving lights on all night when nobody was outside. Motion sensor lights made the space feel calmer and cut down a lot of unnecessary attraction. Another small thing that helped was avoiding direct light aimed into thick plants or bushes where bugs already like to hide. Still, one of the easiest ways to change the entire feel of a backyard is surprisingly simple. One thing that made a surprisingly noticeable difference in my yard was adding a few plants that naturally help repel insects. Not because they magically remove every mosquito overnight, because honestly, no plant does that. But certain herbs and flowers seem to make the area a lot less inviting for bugs. Things like lavender, basil, lemongrass, mint, marigolds, and even catnip all have strong scents and natural oils that insects don't seem to love very much. And the nice part is, most of them are easy to grow and actually useful outside of pest control too. At first, I only added a couple pots near the patio where people usually sit in the evening. Then I started placing some near doorways, along walkways, and between garden beds. Over time, the backyard simply felt more comfortable to spend time in. There were still bugs outside, of course, but not that constant feeling of mosquitoes hovering around every chair. The backyard actually started smelling fresher too, which was an unexpected bonus. Lavender and basil especially made the whole space feel cleaner and more relaxing during summer evenings. The key is using these plants as part of the environment, not treating them like some miracle solution. But even good plants can stop helping if the whole space becomes overcrowded. Another small thing that can quietly make a backyard feel buggy is having too many pots and containers packed tightly together. It looks organized at first, especially on patios or along fences, but those crowded areas tend to hold moisture for a long time. Air can barely move between the pots, sunlight gets blocked, and the space underneath stays damp, even during warm days. That's exactly the kind of environment where insects like to hide during the day. I noticed this in one corner of my yard where I had almost every container grouped together to save space. The plants looked healthy, but that area constantly had gnats, mosquitoes, and tiny bugs flying around whenever I watered. Once I started spreading the pots out a little more, the difference was noticeable pretty fast. I also raised a few containers slightly off the ground and rotated their positions every now and then, so moisture didn't build up in the same spots all the time. It didn't take a huge redesign either, just a little breathing room between things. After changing just a few of these habits, the yard started feeling completely different. After changing a few of these things around my yard, I started realizing the goal was never to create some perfect backyard that looked like a magazine photo. Most people don't have time for that anyway. The biggest difference came from simply making the space less inviting for bugs in the first place. Less standing water, better airflow, fewer damp hiding spots. Small changes, but the yard started feeling calmer and easier to enjoy, especially in the evening. And honestly, that's probably the part I noticed the most. Sitting outside without constantly swatting mosquitoes or seeing bugs flying everywhere made the whole space feel more relaxing again. It also made me pay attention to little habits I used to completely ignore. Sometimes the biggest difference in a backyard doesn't come from adding more things. It comes from removing the small habits that quietly attract problems over time. So now I'm curious, what's one thing around your yard you've probably been ignoring without realizing?